Hi, I'm Bob Apollo. Welcome to the building blocks of outcome-centric selling for complex B2B environments, to our course in which we are going to establish the foundations, and to our first module, where I'll try and answer the question, so what are outcomes? But before I do, I'm often asked where these ideas came from, and the answer is a combination of research and observation. The research draws upon the latest evidence-based research into B2B buying behavior, into winning B2B sales habits, and with a particular focus on complex, high-value B2B buying decisions. And our sources include Rain Group, Gartner, Challenger, the Objective Management Group, and the International Journal of Sales Transformation, and many other sources. But it's also combined with some real world observation. And that really starts with observing the attitudes, the behaviors, and the competencies of top B2B sales performers in complex B2B sales environments. And of course, we're looking for both conscious and unconscious competencies, including things like patterns of learned behavior that have now become habits. And so, what we're trying to discover is, so what are the common attributes that set today's top sales performers apart, and how can these be adopted by their fellow sales professionals? So let's go back to the original question at the start of this module. What are outcomes? Well, you could find dozens of definitions, but I quite like this simple one. Outcomes are changes that follow as a result or consequence of an action or a situation. And when it comes to applying this to the customer environment, I think Steve Jobs had it right many years ago when he said, your customers don't care about you. They don't care about your product or your service. They care about themselves, their dreams, their goals, and they'll care much more if you help them to reach their goals, i.e., their outcomes. But in order to do that, you've got to understand their goals as well as their needs and their deepest desires. Now, I suspect Steve was talking about that in the context of individuals, of consumers. But many of these principles, as I hope to demonstrate to you, are equally relevant in the commercial or organizational environment. So, what is outcome-centric selling? Well, we like to think of it as a groundbreaking approach to B2B selling. It's based on understanding, on influencing, and on achieving our customers' most valuable organizational and personal outcomes, rather than on simply trying to take orders for what we choose to call our solutions. So, in order to try and understand this better, I thought it was helpful to look at the evolution of B2B selling. And of course, in the first phase, a phase I'd describe as product centric, this was really about trying to understand and satisfy our customers' requirements. And in order to do that, our discovery was based on capturing their needs. And when we tried to talk about value, very often it was in the context of features, advantages, and benefits. And at its heart, that's a fairly simple sales process. And this is a really important distinction, as we'll see in a moment, where that sales process is perceived to end when an order is taken. And I'd characterize that as a pretty traditional B2B sales organization mindset. But many organizations, a growing number, are now in what I'd characterize as phase two, a solution centric approach. They recognize that they need to understand and solve their customers' problems. So their discovery isn't just about capturing needs, it's also about uncovering pain. And when a solution-centric sales organization talks about value, it's often based on a projected return on investment of their so-called solution. And of course, inevitably, this feels like a more complex sales process, but just as with the product-centric phase, it's typically regarded as being over when the order's received. And I characterize this as a typical current complex B2B sales mindset. But there's a new phase that we're moving into, and I think a growing number of organizations are either there or already on the journey. And that's what I'd characterize as an outcome-centric approach to B2B selling. And that's really revolves around influencing and achieving our customers' outcomes. And so obviously discovery, as well as try to capture needs and uncover pain, is also focused on trying to shape those desired outcomes. And of course, value then is created by actually achieving or helping our customer to achieve their desired outcomes. And you really need to think of this as a customer success process and not just a sales process, because our customer's buying journey continues until their desired outcomes have been achieved. And that is often long after an order is taken. And I see this, and I hope you will come to see this, as the future of complex B2B sales. And I want to demonstrate to you that adopting an outcome-centric mindset is going to dramatically increase the probability that you will persuade your prospective customer to act, to actually do something, to persuade them to choose you, and of ensuring that you not only get an order, but you ensure lasting customer success and maximum lifetime value. So if you want to find out more about the thinking behind outcome-centric selling, I recommend you download the guide, which is available in the download box in this module. And what you'll learn about is why it's time to focus on outcomes, why every customer needs a unique value proposition, how to facilitate your customer's buying decision journey, and you'll be able to explore our outcome-centric selling toolkit. And of course, you'll learn how to put these principles into practice. And I strongly recommend that you download that guide today, either now or certainly before you log off from this module. Now, let's think about what we mean in a bit more detail about outcomes. And I think we need to think about those customer outcomes from both an organizational and a personal perspective. And of course, the steps or advances that need to be taken in order to achieve those outcomes. So let's start with organizational outcomes. And those are outcomes that affect the customer's organization as a whole, or at least they affect a significant department or a business unit. And these outcomes are typically related to key corporate priorities or initiatives, or to significant business performance metrics or indicators. So when we think about personal outcomes, though, those are outcomes that affect significant members of the stakeholder community. And it's particularly important that we understand the desired personal outcomes of the key executive sponsor and other core decision makers behind a project. And those outcomes are more typically related to things like reputation, to the scope for promotion or advancement, and or to key personal performance metrics or indicators. Now, if we think back now about organizational outcomes, well, these turn out to be really important to organizations formally justifying a decision to change on what appears to be a logical or rational basis. But when we think about personal outcomes, we start to realize these are actually essential to the key individual stakeholders becoming comfortable with a decision to change. And very often there's an element of logic or rationality about that, but there's often a very strong emotional dimension to personal outcomes. And then we combine those organizational and personal outcomes with advances. And so an advance you might think of as a mini outcome are the key steps that organizations and individuals take on their journey towards achieving their ultimate desired outcomes. And when we think a bit more about outcomes, we also realize that they can be either positive or negative. They can either cause a potential customer to decide to take action, or of course, they could cause them to decide to avoid taking action. So, positive outcomes are things that improve on the current situation, and they're usually the consequence of a successful change program. And of course, yes, they make those responsible for the decision happy or pleased about the choices they make. But of course, sometimes we have to face negative outcomes, and those are things that make the current situation worse. And those are often the consequence of either an unsuccessful change program or, of course, of just sticking with the status quo. And they make those responsible for the decision unhappy or angry about the choices they make. Now, here's the interesting thing. When customers are hopeful about the potential consequences of their decisions and the likely outcomes, the likely positive outcomes, their decision making is often driven forward by their fear of missing out. In other words, bad things will happen if we don't do something. But when we think about negative outcomes, now you see, when customers are concerned about the potential consequences of the decisions and the likely or potential negative outcomes, their decision making is often held back by their fear of messing up, FOMO. And that's really about, well, bad things could happen if we do make the wrong decision. So that's why thinking in terms of positive or negative outcomes can be very helpful. And I'd also strongly urge you not just to respond to what your customer currently believes they need to achieve. We also need to educate them on what's possible. So we think about the obvious. Well, these are the organizational or personal outcomes our prospective customer already believes they need to achieve. These are the ways in which our prospective customer believes represent the best way of achieving their currently hoped for outcomes. But of course, our role as a professional salesperson is to open their eyes not just to the obvious, but to the possible. So the possible is about the even better organizational and personal outcomes our prospective customer actually has the potential to achieve, or the even more effective ways in which our prospective customer can achieve their best possible outcomes. Now, if all we do is to stick to the obvious, to respond to our prospects' current sense of what they need and how we or they need to achieve it, we end up diminishing our potential influence. On the other hand, if we can successfully shape our prospective customers' awareness of the possible, we have the ability to increase our influence. So that's why we should always seek to shape and influence our prospective customers' sense of their best possible outcomes and not just restrict ourselves to what the customer currently thinks are obvious. Now, there's another way of thinking about outcomes. We've referred to it. I'll describe it in a bit more detail. And that's this distinction between organizational and personal outcomes. So, as we've learned, an outcome that has a widespread positive impact across the organization as a whole, or a key function or a business unit, is an organizational outcome. And you can see some examples here. And I'm sure you can think of some that relate to your own selling environment. So, it might be that the organization or the business unit reaches its revenue or profit targets, or it achieves or exceeds key performance indicators, or it reaches a key strategic objective, or it eliminates a risk or a constraint to its business, or it successfully completes a significant transition or transformation. And the reason why organizational level outcomes are so important is, if we can show how what we do contributes to our prospective customers' organization achieving its strategic priorities, then the project and our approach to it is much more likely to be achieved. Now, we think about personal outcomes. Well, of course, these are things about that affect the personal circumstances of either a specific individual stakeholder or a group of stakeholders. And again, I'm sure you can think of some examples that relate to your own selling environment, but it's things like that key stakeholder's reputation is enhanced, or they're promoted to a more senior position, or rewarded in another way. They achieve their KPIs or performance targets. They improve their efficiency or their effectiveness. They enhance their own personal sense of self-worth, or they achieve one of their key personal priorities. And so the reason why should be obvious, shouldn't it? Why personal outcomes are important is if we can show how we help the key stakeholders, and in particular the exec sponsors of a project, to achieve their personal goals, well, they're going to be much more likely, aren't they, to support both the project and our approach. Now, we also talked about advances. So advances can be thought of as a completed milestone that represents a significant step forward on our customers' journey to achieving their desired organizational and personal outcomes. So again, I'm sure you can think of examples that are relevant in your own sales environment, but that might be a key stakeholder agrees to share privileged information with us. The decision group includes us on their shortlisted options. The negotiating teams agree mutually acceptable terms, or the decision group submits their final recommendation for approval, or the approval group agrees to issue an order, or some other important key implementation or adoption milestone is achieved. And the reason why these intermediate outcomes or advances are so important is they provide evidence that our customers' buying decision journey, and therefore our sales campaign, is advancing towards a positive conclusion. Now, when we think in terms of trying to help our customer reach their ultimate desired outcomes, well, we can think of that as the destination that justifies their journey. And yes, of course, it combines both organizational and personal outcomes, and it's reached via a series of successful intermediate advances or outcomes. So, in summary, what are outcomes? Why are they so important? They are changes that follow as a result or consequence of an action or situation. We've seen they can span both organization and personal outcomes. They can be positive or negative. And it's our customers' belief in the likely outcomes of any decision that influences the decisions they actually make. And they cause us, or they should cause us, to think more about what our customers want to achieve and why, and less about what we want to sell them. They should cause us to focus on the ends that need to be achieved and not just on the tasks that need to be completed. They should cause us to focus on the quality of the result and not just the quantity of the activity. And as we've seen, the route to achieving our customers' ultimate desired outcomes typically involves a series of advances, of intermediate outcomes. So that's our introduction. And I want to give you the chance to pause and reflect for a moment. And I want to ask you, firstly, how has this module helped you to think differently? How specifically are you going to change the way you think or act as a professional B2B salesperson in response to the ideas and concepts that have been introduced in this initial module? But of course, there's more to it than that, isn't there? And perhaps the more important question is, as you reflect, so what are you actually now going to do differently as a result? What are you now determined that you need to start doing? What do you now realize that you need to stop doing? And how are you going to make what you were already doing even more effective as a result of taking on board some of these ideas? And I want you to pause, reflect, and actually write this down, because it's in the act of writing these reflections, these commitments to yourself down, that you stand the best chance of making change happen. So please do that. Right. We've covered the foundations. I hope you now have a better sense of what we mean by outcomes and that you realize and recognize why they're so important to successful B2B selling. And of course, that you want to apply the thinking in practice to your current and future sales opportunities. And naturally, I wish the very best of success in doing that. But I'd also like to invite you, I hope you're looking forward, in fact, to taking part in our next online module in this course, where we'll be looking at the difference between thinking of things in terms of a sales process and thinking of things in terms of our customers' buying decision journey. And I hope you'll want me to join me online for that module in the very near future.